Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger is a unique and special individual that in the process of creating the Jerusalem Prayer Project between Stephen and I, he has kind of been pivotal in that process, in that he's really been our entree into the world of interfaith peacemakers in the Holy Land. And Hanan is a very unique person who has engaged in something that we, Stephen and I, have seen and firsthand as incredibly courageous in how he is conducting his life, and in the midst, at the crossroads of the occupation in the Holy Land. And it's really critical, and part of his mission is to really engage and foster conversation and contact and interaction between all people of the Holy Land, because they all have a shared interest in its survival and its vitality into the future. I'll hand this over to Stephen if you want to add anything else in here about Hanan.
Well, no, I think you've done a great job, Robert. I think we should just get to Hanan as fast as possible. I just want to say that Hanan is a person who embodies love and peace in his heart, and does all he can to make that the reality in Israel and Palestine and the Holy Land. Ah, there he is. Hello, my dear friend. So
hello, hello. I guess that means I should take the floor.
Yes.
So I'll say good morning, even though for me it's not good morning. It's good afternoon, evening. So good morning to everyone. And thank you for being here. Of course, I have to thank Stephen and Robert for making this connection between me and your group. I'm really sorry that I don't know you, that I'm not in the same room with you, but I'll do my best to feel who you are, and I hope you'll feel who I am. So before I introduce myself, I'm going to introduce you to a piece of ground, a piece of real estate. And this piece of real estate that I'm about to describe is, for me, something like the Garden of Eden. It's a little piece of Palestinian farmland, and it's in a place that has at least 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different names. You might know the place as occupied territory. You might know it as Palestine. You might know it as disputed territory. You also might know it as Israel, or Judea and Samaria, or liberated territory. You might also know it as the West Bank. Now, in this little strip of land that has all those different names, there's a place that I call the Garden of Eden. And the reason I call it the Garden of Eden is because it's the only little parcel in that strip of land where Israelis and Palestinians can meet and do meet every day in dignity, equality, and human rights. That little piece of land, we call it the Dignity Center. We actually don't call it that because we speak a different language. We call it in Hebrew and in Arabic, Merkaz Karama. Merkaz is a Hebrew word that means center. Karam is an Arabic word that means dignity. The name of the place brings together the two languages, Hebrew and Arabic, to create the Garden of Eden. Now, why is it so strange, so wonderful, so out of the ordinary that there's a piece of land, a little center where the two sides, Israelis and Palestinians, can meet as equals in dignity with full rights? Because in every other piece of land in that West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Palestine, disputed territory, liberated territory, Greater Israel, in that piece of land, Israelis and Palestinians live, both, but they live completely separately. Listen to this. The two sides, Israelis and Palestinians, in this piece of land, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, we have different educational systems, different towns and villages, different municipalities. We live under different legal systems. We have different media. We have different school systems, different transportation systems. We have different economic systems. In many places, we even drive in different roads. Some places we drive in the same roads. And when you have Israelis and Palestinians, these two sides, who live so close to each other, the towns and villages, the settlements, the cities, they abut one to the other. They're so close, the two sides, but so far away. There's no human contact at all. We don't know who the other side is. And in addition to that, even if the two sides would want to meet each other, there's no place to do it, because each and every piece of land is theirs or ours. You see, into Palestinian villages in the West Bank, I'm forbidden from going. Israeli military law forbids me from entering there. And Palestinians can't enter Israeli towns and cities and villages and settlements in that same piece of land, the West Bank / Judea and Samaria. Now, it's true that you can get a permit from the army. It's very hard to get it. There is such a possibility, but in daily life, the two sides can't enter the ground of the other side. So we don't know each other. And not only do we don't know each other, we're full of ignorance and stereotypes and bigotry and racism and fear, loathing of the other side. And then comes the Dignity Center. It's a piece of Palestinian farmland that's been dedicated by the owners to creating a better future for both sides. The Dignity Center is the only, and I'm not exaggerating, the only Israeli Palestinian joint community center in the whole area, the whole West Bank / Judea and Samaria. By the way, West Bank is what the Palestinians call it, what the Jews call it Judea and Samaria, the same piece of land. And it's a miracle to see the two sides with their fears and hesitations come to that place for social activities, for religious activities, for cultural activities, for dialogue, and for political discussions. The ice is broken. You discover to your surprise that there's a human being on the other side. And he or she is more or less just like you. You begin to talk in unfacilitated dialogue and facilitated dialogue, in photography workshops, in summer camps, in interfaith dialogue, in music therapy, in trauma therapy, in open houses, in lectures and political discussions. You're surprised to discover the other side is pretty much like you. People come to me after events and they say, that was great. I say, what was so great? They say, you see that guy at the other side of the room? I talked to him. That was so great. We discovered each other, and people begin slowly but surely a process of what I call healing, because we're all sick, Israelis and Palestinians. Bigotry and racism and ignorance and fear is a sickness. I call it the hubris of exclusivity. That's the name of the disease, the hubris of exclusivity. And this disease, this virus, teaches me and convinces me that my truth is the only truth, and my religion is the only religion, and my connection to the land is the only connection to land, and my people is the only real people. You're not true, you don't belong, you're fake, you're fabricated. And people begin to get over this disease through the human contact. That's why I call our Dignity Center, I call it a mental health clinic. What goes on there is trauma therapy, and people become, in my opinion, a little bit more human and a little bit more healthy. They begin a process of healing. Okay, so I introduced the place. I can take 10 seconds to catch my breath. You can take 10 seconds to catch your breath. And I'll introduce myself. My name is Hanan Schlesinger. I'm a rabbi. I live a 20-minute walk from the Dignity Center, Merkaz Karama. I live in an Israeli settlement called Alon Shvut. It has about 3,000 people in it. We are part of an area that the Israelis called Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion. It has about 22, 23 settlements. Most of them are a bit smaller than the settlement I live in. And I'd like to present myself to you using 3 words. The first word is Jew. The second word is Zionist. The third word is settler. And I'm going to take now 3 minutes to unpack what those 3 words separately mean to me. When I say I'm a Jew, I am not talking about religion. It's true, I'm a religious person, but for me, a Jew is not merely a member of a faith, of a religious community. Jews are members of a people, the Jewish people. We have a collective identity that goes back 3,000 years in history, a collective identity such that when I think of myself, I think of every single stage in Jewish history as being part of the events, the experiences that I went through. They're part of my sense of who I am, collective identity. And I know that from the very moment that the Jewish people set forth upon the stage of world history, we were and still are connected to a certain piece of real estate in this world And that piece of real estate, we Jews used to call the land of Canaan. Now we call it the land of Israel. And it's impossible to separate, from my perspective, Jewish identity from the land. We were born there, and we've always been connected to that land. And from now, this point, I said, I'm a Jew, I can start talking about myself as a Zionist. And for me, that's a smooth move from Judaism to Zionism. They're not two different things for me. For me, Zionism is the consummation, the fulfillment of Jewish identity and of all the thousands of years of Jewish history. Now, it's true, Zionism is a modern political movement, but it's a modern political movement that was created in order to take the Jewish people back home where they belong, to fully consummate our visions for ourselves and the prophetic visions for ourselves from 2,500 years ago. Now, you probably know, some of you, that it was only 30 or 40 years after the ministry of Jesus, this was the year 70 of the Common Era, that the Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Commonwealth, burned to the ground the Holy Temple, and sent the Jewish people into exile. And for the past 2,000 years since then, we have been in the four corners of the universe, hoping, praying, yearning to come back home. 3 times a day, we pray to come back to the land of Israel, to reestablish our judicial organs in the land, to reestablish our sovereignty, to rebuild the temple. And now, after all those 2,000 years of hoping and praying and yearning, the Zionist movement has allowed us to fulfill that. Now, I myself was born in New York, not in Israel. But when I was 18, I picked up my 2 bags, I got on the plane, and I did what we call in Hebrew, ani aliti. I ascended to the land. I made aliyah. And there was nothing for me more fulfilling than that. If Jews are able to come home, how could I not do that? And indeed, what I did in my terms is come home. Come home. So I talked about myself as a Jew, I talked about myself as a Zionist, now I'm going to talk about myself as a settler. A settler, that's a word used very often pejoratively to mean an Israeli Jew who lives over the Green Line. The Green Line is the line separating Israel of 1948 to 1967 from the Palestinian territories, from Palestine, from the West Bank, from Judea and Samaria. I live in that disputed territory, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Now, you might ask, why do I live there? Many say that it's illegal according to international law. Many say the settlers are an obstacle to peace. Why do I live there? I live there because of history. You see, when the Jewish people were born 3,000 years ago, we weren't born in Tel Aviv. We weren't born in all the coastal cities, Haifa, Ashdod, Jaffa. We were born in the central mountain range of the land of Canaan that's now called the West Bank. Not only that, but most of the Bible, over 90%, was written in the West Bank. All of Abraham, Sarah, Rachel, all of Moses, I'm sorry, not Moses, Joshua, all of the prophets, they functioned in the West Bank. And during the 1,000 years when the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel, we almost never made it to the coast. We, most of the time, lived in the West Bank that the Bible calls Judea and Samaria. What do I mean the Bible calls it Judea and Samaria? The land south of Jerusalem is the inheritance of the tribe of Judea. The kingdom of Judea was there, begun by King David and Solomon. And north of Jerusalem was the kingdom of the 10 tribes called Samaria. I call it Judea and Samaria because that's what the Bible calls it. I'm there because of history, not just because of the Bible, because of all of Jewish history. Where I live in the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, you can scratch the ground in almost every place and come up with pieces of pottery that the Jewish people left 2,000 years ago. And those pieces of pottery speak to me. They say, you're part of me. I'm part of you. There's a historical continuity here. We're links in a chain of tradition. Where I live in the West Bank, so many people study Bible, but not just in the classroom. We put the Bible in the backpack. We walk into the fields. We stroll on the trails. You open the book, the good book, and you read the verses, and you are where it happened. This is where Abraham walked. This is where Rachel gave birth. This is where David inaugurated his kingdom, and you feel indeed that you are a link in the chain of Jewish history and tradition. For me, that's really, really powerful. 6.5 years ago, I realized that I was blind. I realized that everything I just told you is indeed true, but it's only part of the truth. I learned 6.5 years ago, and I'm still learning, that the stories I just told you are true, but they're not the only story in the Holy Land. For over 3 decades, I thought that my Jewish Zionist story was the only story in the land. I thought that my truth was the only truth in the land. I thought that my connection to that real estate is the only real connection. And since I know that partial truth that thinks itself to be complete truth is falsehood, that means that I think that for over 3 decades, I lived in a certain type of falsehood. For all of those many years, the Palestinians for me were like the gray, drab scenery that passes in the background of the movie, but is not part of the plot, and you can safely ignore. For me, the Palestinians were invisible. They weren't part of the story, even though I, quote unquote, saw them all the time. They're 90% of the population where I live, but I didn't really see them at all. They were invisible, or I was blind. And then it happened. I was driving in my car 6.5 years ago, and I had with me 2 Protestant pastors from the US who wanted me to show them around, to show them they were evangelicals, to show how the visions of the biblical prophets are coming true before our eyes, how the people of the land, the sons and daughters of the Jewish people, are returning home after that long, hard exile. So I showed them around, and we drove. I showed them the roads we paved. I showed them the forests that we planted. I showed them the buildings and the towns that we've constructed. I showed them around with great pride. And as we're driving, I picked up a hitchhiker. And then I picked up a second hitchhiker. And when the second hitchhiker got out of the car, and it was just me and the 2 pastors, well, one of the pastors, Bob from Texas, he said to me, "Hanan, that was a great thing you did. You taught us a lesson in Jewish ethics. You picked up hitchhikers. No one in Texas does that." So I said, "Look, Bob, it's not just me. Around here, we all pick up hitchhikers because we trust each other. We have a common vision. And just like everyone else," I said to Bob, "I do my very best to pick up every person who puts out his finger for a ride." And by the time I finished that sentence, I realized that I was lying. I was lying to Bob and Kevin, but even worse, I was lying to myself. I do not pick up every person who puts out his finger for a ride. A Palestinian had never entered my car at that point in my life. So how did I dare say that I pick up every person? Apparently, I didn't see the Palestinians, or I didn't see them as significant human beings. And perhaps because my 2 guests were pastors, they were men of religion, men of God, and they were friends of mine, somehow that moment opened me up. It was like a confession. And I just felt that I was ripe to experience. And I said to them, there must be something rotten inside me. I felt really embarrassed. And I said to myself that I'm going to do something to fix this. I'm going to find a way to see the Palestinians as human beings. How am I going to do that? To me, the answer was simple. I'm going to meet them. So I began this journey to meet my Palestinian neighbors. Now, there's a Palestinian village literally only half a kilometer from my front door. That's about a 7-minute, 8-minute walk. But I couldn't just go to that village. I'd never been there before, knock on the door and say, I have to meet you for my spiritual journey. That's not going to work. And I was stymied as I tried to meet people. Finally, I got a note on Facebook from someone I didn't know. He was a Protestant pastor, a different Protestant pastor from Reston, Virginia in the US. And he told me that he heard through someone else who heard from someone else that I, Hanan Schlesinger, wanted to meet my Palestinian neighbors. And he wrote to me that he can help me. He wrote that he can help me because as a Christian evangelical minister, he has a ministry in which he took upon himself to come to the Holy Land, specifically to Judea, where I live, south of Jerusalem. He comes twice a year, he said. He meets Israeli settlers, he meets Palestinians, and he introduces them to each other. So John Moyle, that's his name, came for, I guess, the 5th or 6th time to the Holy Land in January 2014, and he sat in my living room. We talked a long time, we got to know each other, and at the end of the conversation, he told me when and where to go to meet my Palestinian neighbors. It was a few days later, the day rolled around. It's Thursday afternoon, the last Thursday of January 2014. I go to the front door of my house. My wife says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to meet Palestinians." And she screamed. She said, "You can't do that, they'll kill you." When I approached her and saw the terror in her eyes, I got it, because I was as afraid as she was. But I knew that I had to do this, so I walked out the front door. I decided not to take the car. According to the instructions I got, it looked like it was within walking distance. I walked. My heart is beating. I didn't know what they would do to me, those Palestinians. And I got to a clearing. I walk in, it's Palestinian farmland surrounded by a rock fence. Inside, there's no buildings, there's very few trees, almost nothing, but I saw a miracle. I saw 15 Israelis and 15 Palestinians, and they were talking to each other. I walked up to this woman who wasn't involved in a conversation. She's in brown from head to toe, clearly an observant Muslim. I said hello. She said hello back to me in English. We talked for a minute until I said to her, "I can't believe I'm talking to you." And she said to me, "I can't believe I'm talking to you either, because we don't talk to Israeli settlers." We didn't stop talking. It went on, but very short amount of time, because our son came over. And she told me his name is Yazin. He's 17 years old. Myself and Yazin shake hands, and I see that he's wearing a windbreaker. And on the jacket over the lapel are 3 words in English. And the 3 words were seeds of peace. Seeds of peace. Now, I had no idea what seeds of peace is, but I said to myself, this young man is a Palestinian, and his jacket says peace. That can't be. Those 2 things, peace and Palestinian, don't go together. And I was pretty sure he doesn't know what it means. If he knew, he wouldn't wear the jacket. Perhaps he found it on the ground. Someone gave it to him. So I said to Yazin, half jokingly, "Yazin, what's this seeds of peace thing?" And he goes on to tell me that it's a summer camp in Maine, USA. And it takes Israeli kids and Palestinian kids out of the conflict zone for a summer of recreation and reconciliation. He said he just got back from the camp a few months ago, had a great time. He met Israeli kids there. Now they're friends on Facebook. He said the summer was such a powerful experience that now he wants to spend some of his life devoted to building bridges between Israelis and Palestinians, bridges of peace. And I'm listening to Yazin, and I don't know if I can believe what I'm hearing, because it's impossible. It contradicts everything that I think to be true. And you might say that Yazin was the first Palestinian that began the process of unsettling me. And then his father walks over, Jamal. We shake hands. He's a stocky guy. Jamal tells me that they live in Beit Umar. Beit Umar? Uh-oh. I know Beit Umar. It's a Palestinian town just 6 minutes down the road by car. That's where the terrorists come from. The people arrested for shooting Israelis there. They throw rocks at us from their town onto the road when they're passing. I know the people in Beit Umar. Now I'm talking to one. His kid, that's also from Beit Umar. The mother, she's also from Beit Umar. How can I talk to these people? They're terrorists. And it wasn't comfortable for me. And Jamal starts telling me the story of his life. I'm going to tell you 2 anecdotes that I remember. First, he told me, he said, Hanan, you know that in Beit Umar, we're Palestinians. There's no Israelis there. There's no Jews. But there's the Israeli soldiers. And we hate the Israeli soldiers because they make life miserable for us. And since they're the only Israelis we know, by extension, we hate all the Israelis. And he told me no one in Beit Umar would ever want to meet an Israeli socially, except, Jamal said, except for my neighbor. He said he had this neighbor years ago who invited Jamal to tag along to an interfaith dialogue session between Muslims and Jews in the city of Jericho. And Jamal told me the following. He said, when my friend asked me to come with him, I said, never. I'm never coming with you because that's only for the traitors and the weak people. But Jamal's friend wouldn't get off his back, kept trying to convince him, until it happened that Jamal said, okay, I'll come with you just to please you. Jamal said that he went with his friend. Everyone sat in a big circle in this room in Jericho, but I, Jamal, he said, I didn't participate. I sat outside of the circle in the corner, but I listened. And at one point, one of the Israeli men stood up from his chair and looked at me, Jamal said. And I was really afraid, why is he looking at me? He started to walk right towards me. I didn't know what he'd do to me, came right up to me and he forced me to shake his hand. Then he asked me questions. I had to enter into a conversation with him and it was really, really uncomfortable until the guy finally left. I wiped the sweat off my brow, Jamal said, and I ran to the bathroom to wash off the filth from my hand after touching an Israeli. And I vowed never to come back to this place. Jamal at home told his wife about the terrible experience he had. She agreed. He made a mistake going there. They should sweep it under the rug, never tell anyone, just forget about it. But Jamal's friend wouldn't forget about it. And Jamal's friend kept trying to bring him back there. Jamal refused. But after a long process, Jamal said, okay, I'll go back with you. I'll go back. He went. The next time his wife came. And then their children came. They went back again and again. And then Jamal ends the story and he looks at me and says, Hanan, where I thought there was only an enemy, I met a human being and a partner, and it changed me. And I'm listening to Jamal, and the same thing is happening to me that happened when I listened to his son talk a few minutes ago. I couldn't believe it. Palestinians don't get involved in interfaith dialogue. They're just violent terrorists, I thought to myself. And I was getting more and more confused. And Jamal tells me now another story. He says, Hanan, you know, the little kids in Beit Umar, when they see someone who looks like you, they start to cry. I said, Jamal, why do they start to cry? And he said, Hanan, you don't understand? I said, no, I don't understand. And he was flustered by the fact that I didn't understand why those kids cry when they look at people who appear like me. So he said, Hanan, it's the kippah on your head. You don't understand that? It's the beard. It's those white fringes hanging from your pants. Because all the people that dress like you, they carry submachine guns and they walk into Beit Umar and they kill the kids. Now, I had no idea what he's talking about. And actually, I said to myself, this is a bald lie. This is on the verge of anti-Semitism. But somehow, I understood my place at that moment was not to argue with him and not to tell him that he's wrong. It's to listen. I understood that this is a moment of blessing for me. I'm experiencing how the other experiences me. And if I can just hold that and not lash out on anger, I'm going to be a better person. It was hard not to refute him. I felt the churning in my stomach. I felt the rage. There was silence. I didn't know what to say. And then suddenly a light bulb goes off in my mind. And I say, well, my neighbors, they carry guns. That must be frightening to the little kids, the Palestinian kids. We look so different to them and we carry guns. So finally I said to Jamal, after it seemed like an eternity had passed, I said, Jamal, what do you want? We carry guns because we're afraid of you. And he said, no, you're not afraid of us. We're afraid of you. I was completely confused. They're afraid of us. And then later we sat in a circle, 15 Israelis and 15 Palestinians. And the owner of the land on which we were sitting, Ali Abu Awad, welcomed us. And he said, welcome everyone. My name is Ali Abu Awad. Thank you for coming here today. I'm a Palestinian from a proud Palestinian family. We go back generation upon generation to a village called Kubeba. In 1948, Israel threw us out of our village. You guys, you Israelis, now call it something else, Lachish, Kiryat Gat. And we were exiled here to the West Bank, to Beit Umar. 1967, Israel came and conquered us again. And since then, since 1967, we've been living under the rigors and the difficulties of the Israeli occupation. Israeli, what did he say? Occupation? I had no idea what he was talking about. I'd heard that word on the radio. I'd read in the newspaper. But I never really knew what that was because I didn't see it. When I walk in the fields of Judea, when I ride on the roads of Samaria, I don't see occupation. I see the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. I see the return of the Jewish people to our ancient homeland after 2,000 years of exile. And suddenly this Ali Abouad character is telling us that our Jewish sovereignty and our Jewish victory and triumph of the Spirit is his nation's tragedy. And my nation's justice is his nation's suffering. He talked about living under occupation. He talked about seeing his mother beaten up in front of his eyes by Israeli soldiers. He talked about the Israeli soldiers coming into the house in the middle of the night and arresting people. He talked about his mother being sentenced to 6 years in Israeli jail, and he was sentenced to 10 years and never told what the charges were. He's saying all these things, and they're confounding me. They're making me fly into a rage. How could this be? It's not true. But he couldn't be lying because he's not trying to convince anyone. He was telling his life story. I went home, challenged, confused, upset, and I entered into something like a spiritual depression. I remember days and weeks pacing back and forth in my study, trying to figure this out. It was clear that I had heard stories that I'd never heard before. Stories that the people who lived around me, 5 kilometers and 3 kilometers and 1 kilometer from me, stories that all these Palestinians thought to be true. And I realized that I have to come to terms with this. I'd have to see if there is anything in what they're saying. So I went back to that same piece of land where I'd met Ali the first time, and we met again. And we met a second time and a third time and a fourth time. It wasn't just me. There were a number of Israelis who wanted to meet Ali Abouad. There were a number of Palestinians who were gathering around. And over the course of months, we probably spent hundreds of hours in discussion. And I really can't explain how it happened, but somehow we set down unconsciously guidelines that said we're not there to argue, and we're not there to contradict. We're not there to prove that we're right and you're wrong. We're only there for one purpose that has two sides to it. We're there to tell stories and to listen to stories. The Palestinians told their story, their history, their suffering, their belonging to the land, their aspirations again and again and again. And we Israelis listened. And to listen to their stories, mark my words, was like a dagger to our hearts, because their story contradicts our identity. But we listened. Sometimes we wanted to run away, but we stayed and listened. And after we listened, we told our stories. We told our Jewish Israeli story. We told the story of 3,000-year connection to the land, 2,000 years of exile, of coming home. And when an Israeli Jew says we've come home to that land, it's like a dagger to the hearts of the Palestinians because it contradicts their identity. And we began to realize that both sides have an identity that contradicts the other side's identity. The Palestinians say it's Palestine and the Israelis say it's Israel. The Palestinians say there's no such thing as a Jewish people, there's only a Jewish religion. And the Israelis say there's no such thing as Palestinian people, you're Arabs. The Palestinians say go back to Russia, America, where you came from. And the Israelis say to the Palestinians, go back to Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, where you came from. We're playing, we realize, a zero-sum game in which each side builds its identity upon the nullification and the destruction of the other side's identity. But we created this unique space of listening to the two stories and accepting the two stories and legitimizing the two stories. One day, Ali Abouad said to me, Hanan, we have to find a way to fit two truths into one heart. Two truths into one heart and two truths into one land. And that's when Roots was born. We created a movement. We called it Roots, indicating that both Jews and Muslims and Christians, Palestinians and Israelis, we all have roots in that land. And we have to recognize the roots of the other side in that land. And we also called it Roots because we realized in order to solve this conflict, we have to go back to the roots of the conflict. You see, what we learned is that although many people think otherwise, we learned that this conflict is not just about politics. It's not just about resources. It's not just about borders. It's not just about security. It's about identity. It goes back deep, deep into the consciousness of the individual and the collectives on both sides. And we began to realize that all of the politicians in the world, with all the goodwill, negotiating borders and security and resources, that's not going to solve the problem. You first have to negotiate identity. By negotiate identity means you have to listen to the other side's identity, and you have to open up your heart to accept that his truth doesn't have to come at the expense of your truth. There can be two truths in one land and two truths in one heart, which means two peoples living together side by side, but we'll never get there until we go to the roots. So we founded this movement, Roots. In Hebrew, that's Shorashim. In Arabic, that's Judur, the Israeli Palestinian grassroots initiative for understanding nonviolence and transformation. I'll say that again. The Israeli Palestinian grassroots initiative for understanding nonviolence and transformation. And we established the Dignity Center as a hub for activities. It's a community center, but it's also a think tank. It's a place to come and meet the other side and think and ponder. We have activists struggling with how to continue the activism there. And we have the social activities and the religious activities. And people come and they grow and they heal and they go through a process. It's the process of transformation. I myself went through this process. I'm still going through this process. It's not easy. I remember about 10 months into our work at a seminar, a workshop, Palestinians, Israelis, when we came up with our vision statement, a vision that says, we foresee Palestinians and Israelis recognizing each side's historic rootedness in this land and living together in dignity, equality, and human rights. When we came to that statement, I cried, not out of joy, because I felt I was almost traitorous to admit that the other side has just as much right as I do. I was constantly struggling with my identity in a process of gradually expanding it. That's not easy. It's just about the hardest thing in the world, because I want to add another element to this, which is that the people in Roots, most of the Israelis and most of the Palestinians, are religious people. And for a religious person, at least where we come from, to admit that there's truth on the other side of the aisle is not easy. You see, until Roots, until our movement, which we began, like I said, 6.5 years ago, most of the peacemaking, of the peace building in Israel and Palestine was done by what's called the secular left. I have nothing against the secular left, but it's something different than what we're doing in Roots. In the secular left, it's very often Palestinian Muslims who don't believe in Islam talking to Israeli Jews who don't believe in Judaism. Now that's okay. That's okay. But it doesn't get to the heart of the issue. Because when you're able and willing to put your historical identity aside, then you can come to a compromise but that compromise doesn't speak to the religious people on both sides, not these religious Jews and not the religious Muslims and Christians. The Oslo Accords, which made peace here over 20 years ago, didn't succeed, partially because it was secular Muslims talking to secular Israelis. They didn't go to the roots of the issue, the history, the religion, the culture, the identity. They only talked about politics. They came to a surface peace plan, and that alienated many of the religious people on both sides. Those religious Muslims who were alienated by the peace process of Oslo became what we call today Hamas, the enemies of peace. And on the Israeli side, those who were alienated by the peace process became what's called the settlers, the religious right, the enemies of peace. What we're doing in Roots is we're bringing the two enemies of peace together to talk to each other. We're bringing the religious right on both sides. We're bringing the people who are most connected to their historical, religious, cultural identity. The people who don't see a human being and certainly don't see a partner on the other side, we're bringing them together to begin to see a human being and a partner on the other side. And we in Roots believe that we are in our pre-political work, our work on identity, that we're preparing the groundwork for a future of peace and justice and reconciliation in this little piece of land that both sides call home. Thanks. Let's open it up for a discussion.
Hanan, I'm the chair of ICUJP.
You have to unmute yourself again, Steve.
I'm the chair of ICUJP, and I want to thank you, Hanan. We'll have more commentary, but I'm eager to open this up to questions, and Anthony will conduct the questions and answers.
Okay, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes, we'll start with Michael. And then Genevieve.
Where's,
What are you looking for?
raise my hand.
In the participants panel, if you, at the bottom of
Yes.
the participants panel, you can click raise hand.
Right.
Boy. Well, I guess I would have to say I'm glad you're doing the work you're doing. I say a little bit about my own background. I was raised Orthodox. I am no longer practicing Orthodox. I say myself as culturally Jewish. I'm part of If Not Now, which is Young U.S. Jews Against the Occupation, and BDSLA, which does work around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I was mainly saddened by what you said at the beginning, because I feel like I understand you want to do pre-political work, but the problem you identified is so essentially political. You talked about the fact that people don't relate and talk to each other, and you actually said it's the Israeli military that enforces that separation. So to me, the pivotal work is to stop that role of the Israeli military and to stop the aid that the US provides to the Israeli military. And given what's happening in the world right now, the fact that 2 days ago, Israel had plans to annex, not just to occupy, but to annex the land you're talking about, I think that I understand the work you're trying to do on a personal basis, and I value it, but I think the challenge is to do much more than that. And you can classify that as secular or political or anything else, but there's the work you're doing cannot come to fruition under occupation. The story, I did a lot of work around Puerto Rican independence. I'll try to be brief. And the Puerto Ricans talk about the fact that they cannot have a legitimate plebiscite in Puerto Rico about the status of Puerto Rico, which is the divided question among Puerto Ricans, because the US occupies Puerto Rico. And the story they tell is about a small town in Austria. There was supposed to be a vote on Anschluss, if you know what I'm talking about. Hitler claimed that Austria was part of the German Reich, and they had a vote. And only one town actually held a vote prior to the German occupation of Austria. And that town voted 99% against Anschluss, against unification with Austria. And then Germany occupied, and they held the vote nationally, and the town voted 99% for unification with Germany. And until you end the occupation, there's no possibility of the kind of reconciliation you're talking about.
I have a lot of agreement with you. I think the disagreement between us is small. I would say that you're right. The occupation is an evil. The occupation has to end. As long as the occupation continues, there can't be any justice and there can't be full reconciliation. You're certainly right about all that. The thing is that our work in Roots goes further than that. We say the problem is not just the occupation. The problem is deeper than that. Because you see that if we end the occupation and we have a Palestinian state in what is now occupied in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, and we have Israel in the 1948 to 1967 border, we still didn't solve the problem. The problem is still there because historical Palestine is not just the West Bank. Historical Palestine is the whole land, including what is Israel. And historical Israel is not just the state of Israel on the other side of the Green Line, it's also what's called Palestine. In other words, both sides believe that the whole land is theirs. And you know what? I believe that both sides are right. I believe both sides are right. When the Palestinians say that the whole land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean is Palestine, they are right. Hamas is right. But I also believe that when the right in Israel says the whole land is ours, the whole land is Israel, they're also right. So for me, if we just solve the occupation, we've solved the big problem, but the core essential problem is still there, that both sides claim the whole land. And therefore I believe we have to solve the occupation, but not just the occupation. We have to go to the core of identity, and we have to go through a process of discussing and legitimizing and accepting the other side's identity. And that will eventually lead to a solution that's not just a two-state solution, because the two-state solution steals from the Palestinians 78% of their historical homeland. And it steals from the Jews 22% of their historical homeland. There has to be some type of plan that gives both sides the whole land. And I'm not going to discuss the potential plans for how you do that, how you give the whole land to both sides. I'm not in favor of the one-state solution, but if anyone asks, we can talk about that later. I just want to add one more thing to my answer to Michael. And again, I want to emphasize that to a large degree, I think we're on the same page, even though it sounds like we have some differences. As everyone knows, and as Michael certainly knows, the vast majority of Zionist Jews hear BDS, which Michael mentioned, and they go ballistic. Because they, which includes all of my friends and neighbors, they see BDS as a threat to Israel's security and to Israel's existence. But I'm not going to go into that. I just want to make one point about BDS. I certainly believe in nonviolent resistance, Palestinian nonviolent resistance, and BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction is nonviolent resistance, which means that I have to be in favor of BDS. And I am. I'm in favor of the Palestinians bring to bear any pressure they can on Israel. Let me put it this way, I'm in favor of their right to do it. But I don't think it works. Although I can hear both sides of the picture, the reason I don't think it works is because the corollary of boycott, divestment, and sanction is cultural boycott, boycotting dialogue, boycotting human connections. What happens as a result of BDS, and I have to deal with this every single day of my life, is that Palestinians are afraid to talk to me because it violates the boycott. In other words, boycott has gone from an economic measure to a cultural measure that tries to deny the existence of the Israeli side. And what happens is, then we can't talk. We can't meet. And under those circumstances, Palestinians remain devils in Israeli eyes because we can't get to know them. And Israelis remain devils in Palestinian eyes because they can't talk to us. And we continue this vicious cycle of denying the other side's identity and legitimacy. You don't know how many Palestinian friends I have who are afraid to put on Facebook that they're friends with me. They're afraid to put their pictures on the Roots website. They're afraid to come to our activities because if it gets known that they have dialogue with a settler, if it becomes known that they send their kids to the day camp with my grandchildren's day camp, they will be tarred and feathered. Some of them have even been violently abused and lost their livelihood because they dared to try to achieve Palestinian freedom by talking to me. And that's terrible. That's just terrible. So I would want to see BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction, remain an economic movement and not become what it's come today, a cultural movement of denying the right of Palestinians to try to achieve their independence and freedom through talking to the enemy. And I can tell you that talking to the enemy changed me. I used to be an enemy of Palestinians until 6.5 years ago, and I became a freedom fighter for Palestinians. That was only achieved by people who are willing to violate the boycott against talking to me.
Thank you very much, Hanan. And I think next is Genevieve and then Joe Mashlish.
Well, I think it's amazing what you're trying to do, Rabbi, but what kind of results are you finding in this time? Are you making any progress at all? I mean, other than having a few friends on either side, how are you affecting the government? How are you affecting the governments there? What can be done?
I divide between the macro and the micro. The macro is the political change that we all are working for, that there'll be an end to the occupation, that the two sides will live together in dignity and in freedom and in equality. And on that level, the macro level, things have only gotten worse since I've been involved in the peace movement for the past 6.5 years. The Israeli peace movement is decimated. The Palestinian peace movement is decimated. We have very, very, very little political power. And that has not gotten better. It's only gotten worse, like I said, in the past 6 years. What I can say is on the micro level, we have seen success. But what I mean by that is the hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of Israelis and Palestinians who've been transformed into seeing a human being and a partner on the other side, who've been transformed such that their identity is no longer just my story, but it's my story and their story as well. That's a drop in the bucket, I agree. But we need those drops in the bucket, because even if there is movement on the political level, the people won't accept it. The people won't accept a peace solution until we know in our hearts that the other side is legitimate. So the political movement, the work has to go forward, but we also have to do the micro work on the ground, individuals becoming open to the truth and legitimacy of the other side. Now, beyond the hundreds of people that I know have been transformed, Israelis and hundreds of Palestinians, have we made a greater splash beyond us? I don't know. My Palestinian partners tell me that we have. My Palestinian partners tell me that publicly, very few Palestinians come out in favor of roots, but privately, he tells me privately they're all on board. They know that our way is the only way, but they're afraid to speak up because they will be tarred and feathered by the ruling powers in their society. That's what I'm told by my Palestinian partners.
Well, it's very sad that there isn't an alliance of those people and that they don't have the ability to write articles anonymously if necessary in Israel and to spread that achievement.
Well, so articles in Hebrew in the Israeli press, we can write. They're not published by usually not published by the right-wing newspapers, although we just had a victory a few days ago. One of our articles was published. A lot of stuff is published about us on the left-wing side in Israel, but on the Palestinian side, we've written articles and our Palestinian partners, and they've always decided at the last minute that it's too dangerous to publish them. And I really want to tell you that it's at least 4 years that we've been writing these articles, and that the Palestinians always say the time is not right to publish them. I will say, though, that Roots wrote a statement against annexation from our perspective, why we think it's a terrible thing. And we published it in English, we published it in Hebrew, and it's been translated into Arabic. And I am hoping that tomorrow, literally tomorrow, our Palestinian partners will decide that the time has come to publish it in Arabic. It's against annexation, so it should win them points, but it's signed by Israelis and Palestinians together. So that's really, how should I say, edgy. That's really on the cutting edge in their society. I hope they have the courage to publish it. And if they don't, I will be disappointed, but I will understand that they have to work within the framework of their society. And I can't really understand the framework of their society.
Thank you, Rabbi. And we have two more speakers coming, questioners coming up, Joe and then Stephen Fisk.
Sorry, Anthony, are you seeing my hand?
Okay, Arena, yeah, there's several others. We have a system where you go to participants and you can raise your hand that way.
Oh,
okay.
I've raised my hand since the beginning. Okay.
All right. Well, we'll make sure you get a chance. We'll try,
Okay.
because we've got a lot of people who've raised their hand electronically, but we don't want to leave you out, Arena.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right. It's not easy being a facilitator. We've got
Okay,
we gotta
thanks.
be sensitive to the different people who are on our list. I've been in the same situation as Arena, and I know it's frustrating. So let's go with Joe next, and then Stephen, and then we'll include Arena third on this list. Okay?
Very good,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. I didn't know.
Okay.
Han-
So Joe, you're
Hanan,
next, then Stephen, then
right.
Arena.
Right, Hanan, you and your partners of whatever brand of identity are dealing with a core issue for conflict and for escalated conflict. As a mediator, I've studied escalation and de-escalation, and one of the more extreme points of escalation is that identity conflict that you mentioned. And it naturally developed as the focus as you explored the conflict within yourself and with the other people. I've got here an article, by the way, this is applied across all of human social issues, personal and social. And so you are kind of pioneering, not alone, but with others, on working on that. I'll read you a headline of an article. In LA, Black activists debate the value of dialogue with police in reform efforts. So many kinds of issues. And I guess it comes down to, what does our suffering and fear do to us? Does it make us speechless? So in that sense, I'm very much excited by hearing about the progress, and it has implications for the politics, and maybe it's the real core of what's going on beneath political problems. 4 years ago, I asked you a question. You said I was the only man who asked about how your wife was doing with your activities. You mentioned in your talk today that some people did bring along their family members. And so I'd like to study what helps people become friendlier and dip their toes into the activities and experiences that you have, and what keeps them from it, and how can we support ourselves in secure identity, secure enough to dare to hear the other story, and what prevents us from doing it. And I thought a personal question might be one way for you to get into this, but what helps us take these steps, encourage each other, and what restrains us, besides sometimes specific fears and retaliation, of course. But maybe you could start with your own family and story, if you don't mind. And I'd like to hear about that, because this is the pioneering effort for us being, for any social progress.
Thank you for the question. I will try to remember all the things that are now churning in my mind in answer to what you brought up. First of all, I want to say that I'd love for you to send me any articles on the subject that you think are relevant, because I see that we're on the same wavelength. You can get my email from someone, from Robert or from Stephen. First, I'll say that we've discovered, both Israelis and Palestinians have discovered, that there's very little we can say to our own people to change their minds. If I try and convince Israelis that the Palestinians are good people, for example, or a Palestinian tries to convince his own friends that the Israelis are good people, it doesn't work. The only people that can convince an Israeli that Palestinians are okay is a Palestinian. And the only people that can convince a Palestinian that Israelis are okay is an Israeli. That's what we've seen. So what that means is political discussions with my neighbors, with my Israeli neighbors, are out of the question. They won't get us anywhere. The best I can do is to convince my Israeli neighbors to meet a Palestinian. And the best my Palestinian partners can do is to convince their neighbors to meet an Israeli. And it's that human contact in the proper framework that makes the difference. Because when you meet the human being, you immediately begin to see that many things that you thought are just not true. Our stereotypes are so deep that within an hour you discover that I had misconceptions, and that realization of the misconceptions begins to erode your identity, which is a good thing. It begins to pierce the hard outer shell, the callous shell of your exclusivist identity, and that's a good thing. Okay, so after having said that, a personal story. My wife was very taken aback at the beginning. She was very against the whole thing. She was afraid. It's about fear. And I insisted that we have Ali Abu Awad over for dinner. She didn't want to have him over for dinner. By the way, it's illegal to have him over for dinner. Palestinian to come into an Israeli home is illegal. I had to get a special permission from high ups in the army to make it happen. And the condition was that there's an armed guard when he comes. So we had Ali over for dinner. And later, the way Ali tells the story is, he says the following: Hanan, when your wife first made me coffee, that's when we began to break the ice. And look, she discovered that he's a human being. And he's a very special human being. He's no normal human being. And she also began to struggle. How could this be that he seems normal? And it contradicts everything we know. Everyone goes through their own process, but today my wife deeply identifies with the work we're doing. She's come to our activities. Not only my wife, also my children know about it. It's the only thing I talk about. One of my daughters sends her kids to our summer camp. Those are my grandchildren. Another one of my daughters actually has been completely transformed. She's been the director of our summer camp for 3 summers now. So it certainly has an effect on my family, a positive effect. Now, to try and look at the principles, so who agrees to come and meet the other side? Can I identify the characteristics? I really can't. I'll just say 2 brief things. One, is that where we live here in the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, 35 years ago, and 40 and 45 and 50 years ago, even though there was still occupation, there were relationships. There were open borders. Israelis and Palestinians could then have gone into people's houses, and they did. And older people, people over 60 today, remember those days. Some of them are open to meeting the other side. And secondly, among young people, you know, young people's minds are more open, fluid, plastic. There are some young people who are deeply, deeply entrenched in the identity, the zero-sum game, the exclusivist identity of their side. But there are some young people, I can't tell you percentages, I don't know, not a sociologist, that come to our activities and they get it. We have a youth movement, a high school program of 15 Israeli kids and 15 Palestinian kids that meet twice a month. And by the end of the year, they're completely different from their peers, completely different from their peers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I'm aware that you have Shabbat coming up in a while. Can you tell us how many more minutes approximately you have?
I can take 15 more minutes.
Oh my goodness. You know, honestly, I could listen to you for hours. You are so, what you're doing seems so important and fascinating to me. But I'm aware we have 15 minutes and we have 7 questioners. So we don't have enough time for everybody to give a commentary, but I'd like to have 2 people at a time, just a question, okay? So Stephen Fisk and Irena, please, each of you, just ask a brief question so we can hear as much as possible from the rabbi.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Hey, Hanan. Thank you so much for coming and giving your time and your wonderful articulation. I also feel in your presentation there was not enough of Ali and not enough of the Palestinian voice.
Yeah.
So I want to read a quote from Ali that I excerpted from the many interviews we've done with Ali and with you. And Ali Abu Awad says, quote, "My real enemy is not the Jewish people. It's their fear. The fear of the Jews is our biggest enemy, and the daily suffering of the Palestinians under the military occupation is the biggest enemy for the Israelis." That's a very deep statement going to the roots. And I always believe that underlying the political reality is an underpinning of consciousness and emotions and the roots of that the people share, but they don't know it. So I want you to address a little bit more about that fear factor that is the underpinning of the conflict.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll just say that Ali Abu Awad certainly has been my spiritual mentor for these 6 years. He's my rabbi. And much of what I believe, I learned from him. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here with you today. That's absolutely clear. Ali is a great man. Look, there's no doubt in my mind that a lot of Jewish Israeli identity is based on fear. When I say fear, we should expand that to trauma. In a very short statement, I'll say that Jewish tradition preserves, and rightly so, the memory of 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. The Jewish people have suffered a lot, and we remember that. We have fast days, we have prayers, ceremonies that remember that persecution. And it's very important that a people remembers its history. However, there's also a negative side to that. We carry around and we repeat our trauma through our prayers and rituals and historical memory, and we end up, so I believe, re-traumatizing ourselves. A religious Jew, a traditional Jew, remembers what the Egyptians did to us 3,000 years ago when we were slaves, as if it was yesterday. We remember all the pogroms of Jewish history. We remember the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition in 1492, and we live the Holocaust in our consciousness. And I think, and what happens is that for many of us Jews, the Palestinians have become nothing but the next reiteration of the anti-Semitism of 2,000 years. I'm not saying that that's the right way to understand it. I'm just saying that's a snapshot of our identity. And that identity, like I said, traumatizes and re-traumatizes us every day. When we remember it, we're re-traumatized. Every time there's violence between Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis are killed, we remember the Holocaust. We see the Holocaust about to happen again. Again, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And it ends up, therefore, that Ali is completely right. That one, not the only, but one of the root causes of this intractable conflict is Jewish trauma. And I'll end this portion of my talking by telling you a story. I have two Palestinian Christian partners who years ago went on a trip to Auschwitz to commune with, to connect to the Jewish past of persecution and suffering. And it was very powerful for them and very important for them. Until you understand, as a Palestinian, Jewish trauma and suffering and fear, you won't be able to be an effective peacemaker. But what happened is that one of these two Palestinians who went to Auschwitz to see the death camps knows Hebrew. The tour he was on, the group he was on, was doing everything in English, but he knows Hebrew. And he told me that as his group was there meditating and talking, sitting on the tracks, the railroad tracks of Auschwitz, they saw many, many groups of Israeli high school students on their pilgrimage to Auschwitz. All Israeli high school students go on the March of the Living, it's called, to see what happened to the Jewish people in Auschwitz in the Holocaust. And my Palestinian friend overheard them talking in Hebrew. He saw the Israeli army officers were leading all the groups of kids. And he heard the army officers saying to the Israeli high school kids in Hebrew, we have to have a strong army so this doesn't happen to us again. So Auschwitz and the Holocaust doesn't happen again. You all have to enlist in the army and become officers and make our army strong and powerful. And at that moment, my Palestinian partner understood that for many Israelis, he, the Palestinian, is nothing but the next Hitler. And understanding that is one of the keys to solving this conflict. That's our identity, and we have to go that deep into the roots of the conflict.
Thank you, Rabbi. Wow, that's very powerful. Irena and Steve, could you both briefly ask questions, if that's possible?
Okay, well, I'll do my best. Thank you so much for coming and talking. My main problem to understand you is this conception of the Jewish people. They think that that land is yours. This is the major problem. If everybody thinks, this is my land like 3,000 years ago, then we have to go get it, then the whole world will be in wars and killing each other. In every country, there are people who came thousands of years ago from another country. So this idea is the major problem of what's happening over there. You know that before the Jewish people, there were the Canaanites, there were lots of other tribes. So it's not only the Jews. And if you really think as a rabbi that everybody has the right to go live there, how about the Palestinians, the right of return? They were kicked out and, they cannot even go and visit their relatives. I mean, it seems like you are for peace.
Yeah,
You
that's a
should
good question.
What's the question?
Okay.
But you're talking about the right of return, right? That's the question. We really need to have questions.
Can you please try to advocate for the right of return so people can be treated equally? That's my question.
Okay. Good question, Steve. What is your question? Just we want to see if I can.
I have a bad memory. I'll forget if I don't answer her right away.
Okay. Right of return. Okay.
I agree with everything that Irina said. I deeply do. You are right. Jewish identity that ties us to the land and that leads us to believe that it's our land. You're right. That's the problem. Of course you're right. If it was not for that identity, there wouldn't be a conflict. If we had an identity that said we can go create our state in Uganda or in upstate New York or Montana, where theoretically, let's say there was no one there, or Antarctica, there wouldn't be a conflict. You're 100% right. But once we say that, where does it leave us? Jewish identity that ties us to this land is a sociological fact. Right? I agree, it would be better had it been different, but that's the way we think. That's the way, that's who we are. Just like the Palestinians are connected to the land, we're connected to land. Just like the American Indians or the English are connected to land, their land, that's our identity. So I agree that that identity is the problem, but we can't change that identity because that's the fact for millions of people. What we have to do is expand that identity. We have to make that identity porous and flexible so that not that it is erased or nullified, but rather that it leaves room for another truth as well. Because from my perspective, the land of Israel is the land of Israel. I have a historical connection to it. I want to live in it, but I can't do that. I must not do that exclusively. I must not do that at the expense of another people. I must not do that on the back of another people. And I admit freely that the way we Jews have been settling the land is at the expense of the Palestinian people, and that's wrong. I believe in my identity, but I do not believe in the way my identity is being practiced by my people. And you asked about the right of return. Obviously, you're right. Until we Jews, we Israelis, we Zionists admit that the whole land, like I said, from the Jordan to the Mediterranean is historical Palestine, until we admit that the Palestinians have just as much a right to be there as we do, then there's not going to be a just solution. And in a future, so presently, when we're negotiating identity and talking to each other, we have to embrace the fact that the right of return is just. And then secondly, in the political level, we have to find a political solution that honors both theoretically and practically the right of return. And again, I'm not talking about my political solution, but the political movement I'm part of, which I didn't mention, indeed honors the right of return.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve, Brody?
Yes. Rabbi, there was some controversy of us inviting you to speak here today. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, praying with our feet. How can you remain living in a settlement in light of everything you have told us today is what some of our people asked us when we invited you. Every day you live in a settlement, economically you contribute to the settlements, you eat there, you live there. Isn't the righteous step for you to live elsewhere?
Fantastic question. And it's a question that I have an obligation to grapple with. So 95% of the cases in which I speak together with a Palestinian. I rarely speak alone. and very often I speak with Ali Abu Awad, when that question is asked of me, Ali puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, Hanan, don't answer it, I'm going to answer it. And the answer that Ali gives is twofold. I'll tell you what he says, then I'll say what I say. So Ali says, first of all, that he needs Hanan living where he's living and not back in Tel Aviv. He needs more allies living among the settlers. That's where our effectiveness is. The core of the problem is in the settlements. It is in the West Bank. It is in Judea and Samaria. That's where we need advocates for peace and justice and reconciliation. So Hanan says, Ali says to me, I'm not letting you leave the settlement. That's point number one he makes. Point number two he makes is the following. We have to correct the injustices of the past without creating new injustices in the present. The Nakba, the Palestinian tragedy of 1948, was hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being exiled from their home. That's in a certain sense, one of the beginnings of our conflict. To solve that, we cannot create a new exile of thrusting Jews from their homes in the West Bank. It's not, today we have 4 generations of Jews who live in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. To throw them out, to send them away, is to create new injustice. And that's wrong morally, but it's also wrong as far as real politics goes, because all it does is create more enemies of peace. We have to find a solution that doesn't create more enemies of peace. So that's what Ali says, and I agree, but I also want to add to that, that, as I said earlier, yes, the settlements are a problem, but it's not only the settlements, it's the whole state of Israel. The state of Israel is a problem. If there wasn't a state of Israel, the Palestinians wouldn't be suffering. It's not just that my identity ties me to the West Bank that caused the problem. It's not my identity ties me to Haifa and to Tel Aviv and to Ashdod and to Lud and Ramla. Those are also Palestinian lands. So to go back to Tel Aviv, that solves the problem of the Palestinians in the West Bank, but it doesn't solve the problem of the Palestinians whose home was in Lud and Ramla. Really, what you have to say is I should go back to New York. That will solve the problem. But again, the problem is not just on the ground. The problem is identity. I can go back to New York, but I'll remain with that identity that says I belong in the land of Israel, which means the fundamental problem will continue to exist. And my children or my grandchildren or my co-patriots will live with the hope to come back, and eventually they'll come back and the conflict will begin again. So it's not an issue of leaving my home, in my opinion. What we have to do is not leave my home, but I have to leave behind the exclusivist identity that doesn't leave room for anyone else in the land that I call my home. Which means, I think, that I don't have to leave the settlement, but I certainly have to fight against the systemic injustice created by the settlement movement. The settlement movement has ignored the Palestinians. It's settled in many cases on Palestinian land. It economically deprives them of livelihood, of freedom of movement. As I said earlier, the way my identity is being practiced by my people is wrong. And I have to correct that. And to go back where I started, it's more possible to correct it living where I am than leaving where I am. And that brings, of course, to the whole issue that you're struggling with in America, right? White privilege. What do we whites who live with white privilege, what do? Every moment that we live, we're taking advantage of white privilege unconsciously. Should we stop living? We can't stop living. We can't stop being white. We're not going to go back to England. We'd rather continue to live in America with that white privilege and try to change it. Try to change the systemic Injustice, same thing in Israel. Try and change that systemic injustice.
Thank you, Rabbi. How are we doing with time, Rabbi?
So I want to take 2 minutes to close. I
All right.
really have to.
Okay.
You can invite me back some other time.
Wait.
Can I share the screen?
Sure, please do. Michael, you need to give him sharing privileges.
Let me find him in a second here.
Very briefly, a screen that answers the question, from my perspective, what can you do? What can you do to do something good in a conflict? And I'm sharing the screen right now. I would like to show you that Roots has a website. You can see this on your screen, right? friendsofroots.net. Go to the website and read about the work we're doing. You can also sign up there for a quarterly newsletter, which, by the way, is no longer quarterly. It's now coming out during the pandemic once a month. If you want to go deeper into the conflict, you can read my personal website, where I have many essays there, 40 or 50 or 60, that go into these identity issues that I've been talking about under the tab Palestine-Israeli Reconciliation. You can sign up there on the homepage to receive my monthly blog. You can also like us on Facebook, Friends of Roots. And of course, I ask you to spread the word about the things you've heard in this discussion this morning. You can also donate to Friends of Roots through the website. Obviously, we need great help in solving this conflict. You can invite, after the pandemic, myself and my Palestinian partners to come and speak in your churches or synagogues or mosques or universities. You can host a parlor meeting for us. Now that we're not leaving the country to speak around the US, you can invite us to speak by Zoom in synagogues or churches or mosques or universities or in private homes. Anyone who'd like to get involved more deeply can volunteer for the American Friends of Roots through the website, whether you're a lawyer or an accountant or someone who's good in social media. And then I go down to the next entry on this chart. When visiting Israel or Palestine, visit Israel and Palestine. Meet people from both sides and try to meet people and organizations that are involved in reconciliation. And of course, visit our center. Visit Roots at Merkaz Karam, the Dignity Center. I'll skip down, skipping one of the entries. Fill your Facebook page and social media with positive stories of Israeli-Palestinian rapprochement and reconciliation. Disseminate primarily positive stories and not negative ones. Don't spread stories of fear and hate. Next, encourage your family, friends, and houses of worship to learn the narrative of, to empathize with, and to support both Israelis and Palestinians. Learn Hebrew and learn Arabic. Reach out to people of other religions and ethnicities as you're doing in your group. Learn about them, join or create a framework for dialogue. And I'll add, never, please, never shut down dialogue. Never shut down dialogue. Always try to meet the people and talk to the people who you don't agree with, the people who you think are bad and evil and are bringing your country or my country to ruin. The people you think are terrorists, talk to them. That's what I believe. And I'd like to close with just 2 or 3 sentences, which is, if you came into this meeting this morning as a strong advocate and supporter of the Palestinians, please remain a strong advocate of the Palestinians. And if you came to this meeting this morning as a strong advocate of the Israelis, please remain as a strong advocate of the Israelis. But do not advocate for one side at the expense of the other. Advocate for your side and the other side so that both sides become your side. The slogan is, be pro-Israel and be at the same time pro-Palestine. That's the only way to be a strong advocate for peace, justice, and reconciliation. Thanks very much, guys. I'm going to leave.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the entire organization as chair, I want to thank you. And I want you to make a promise. We want to hold a Dignity Center circle of Palestinians and Jews at an ICUJP Friday morning meeting in the future.
Yes.
We want to be in your circle. We will be respectful. We may stand back and listen, or we may participate as you and Ali see fit, but we want to experience and participate with all of you.
I'll talk to the people involved. We'll see what we can do.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Hanan.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.